Hi. It's really nice to be back doing a new episode. It's been a very long time since I've recorded one. The last time I did one was around Christmas. A lot of things unfortunately happened, which meant that the podcast had to take a back seat. That is something I'll talk about another time. But I'm really happy that I'm back. I hope if I can get myself committed to this, I will start being on other platforms. But for now, I'm on YouTube, my original home. I have actually started on TikTok. So if you want to find me, it's Dr. Umar, Little Heart Doctor. And I'm making a slow emergence onto Instagram. And again, it's Dr. Umar Mahmood. And so what I thought would be appropriate to talk about, come it is now September, is becoming a reg. We've all, I made that transition a long time ago, and some of you might be making that transition now, or has just made that transition, or will soon make that transition. And so I thought it'd be useful just to tell you bits about what it was like for me making that transition, but also some advice I can pass on to you to help you through that transition. Is what I like to do. I like to help people with their training. So it really only dawned to me sort of 6-7 months before I became a reg that I was going to become the reg, and it was because everyone just kept on saying, well, what are you going to do, because you're going to be the registrar. What would your plan be? And they just throw these backhand comments like they're trying to teach you when you're like, look, it's really busy, I'm trying to get a plan off you. Well, what do you want to do? You're going to be the reg next month, or and that's really unhelpful. I generally think I think the intention is to be helpful, but as a person on the other end of that, I don't know if it's that helpful. I don't know, if you really cared about me being the registrar, you would have probably had a chat with me early. And it's really good that deaneries are now addressing that, years later, and that's great. But at that time, that's what was happening. We didn't have a formal registrar day, registrar transition sort of week or whatever. We just became the reg the next day. So when it dawned to me, because I am someone, I think, who tries to foresee what's coming. And I don't like leaving things last minute, though sometimes I think my behaviour does come across like that. And I was doing tertiary neonates at the time. I knew I was going to stay on and become the reg for tertiary neonates. And neonates terrified me, because it was very regiment, very protocol driven. And you would think that would make it easy, but I just felt like neonates was very different to peds. I think I've always been a peds person, and so being the reg, being the person that everyone came to, being the port of call when things go wrong, terrified me. So one of the things I did, I had an honest chat with my registrar at the time. He was a really nice guy. I said, I'm actually quite worried. And I think that honesty and that chat I had reassured me that everyone goes through the same thing. So I didn't feel abnormal. But also, I got a bit of mentoring. And I'm very pro mentoring. Like, that's why I do it as a coach. I think it's really important to have someone sort of be non-judgmental, not biased, and just help you through. And I really enjoy being a mentor, but I needed a mentor myself. I got that, and it was very helpful. Guided me away from doing things that what may have come across like useful, but probably wasn't going to be. So I saved myself some trouble with that. But the other thing I did is I ended up getting the Robinson textbook, and for those who know what that is, the Robinson, yeah, I'm sure that's the right one. It's massive 2-volume textbook. I read it back to back, both. I don't know how much I retained, But I really sat there and I tried to think about each system, each condition. How do they differ? What am I going to do with this child? What's the right thing? I started being so much more in tune with the practicality of my job. And it just made me realize, as an SHO, I just went from knowing nothing, being a fetus, knowing something, being confident, but being complacent, and just getting by. And then realizing I don't really understand as much as I think I do. And so that, I think, there was a massive learning curve that occurred in that sort of time coming up to being a reg and being the reg, which, I think did help. And then I was in charge, and the pressure that you get sort of, it gets put on you can be quite immense, and everyone wants you, and you are the person. You've got to make sensible plans, and you've not been trained to be that way. It's made too easy to just ask the reg, speak to my consultant. I think that's a big problem in pediatric training, which again I think I'll talk about in another episode, what I think the problems are within peds training. But now I knew I was going to be in a position where I couldn't really turn to many people. I was the person people were being turned to. So I did a lot of reading, started thinking more practical, and I just had to embrace it, weather the storm, as it were. I can tell you it does get easier, and there is something that happens that you do rise to the occasion. But of course, you've got to engage with the process. So I definitely was worried going in. I think it's very normal if you are a registrar, or soon to be registrar. This is very normal. It's very normal to feel you don't know anything. It's very normal to feel vulnerable. It's very normal to feel like you're about to be judged. Don't worry about that. I think you just get on with it and really put a lot of your energy into this transition bit, because that will really put you in a good position moving forward. So what is my advice to you as a soon-to-be reg? So one of the things I always say to people is become practical ready. So whenever I've done teaching, I teach in a way now which is very practically base. I don't like just teaching topics and telling you the science and just some generic list of investigations and whatnot. I like to be very practical based. For example, you've got the baby who's coming with bronchiolitis, and you sort of know as an SHO, if they're not feeding and they need oxygen, they're in hospital, and if that's all okay, they can go home. And you've got this thing where you just sort of work on this autopilot. But then what happens if they need to be in hospital and need oxygen? When do you start Optiflow? Nurse turns to you. Where do you want the Optiflow to be? Say that you're escalating the Optiflow. Now you want to de-escalate it on the ward route. Where do you start? When do you start? How do you do it? Or when do you start CPAP? What are the criterias? And again, how do you escalate, de-escalate that? When do you tube? And these are all very practical based questions, because you've got to make a decision. You have to justify your decision, and you are going to be talking to transport services as the reg, and you need to show that you are being very sensible in that process. So all of those things are, very practical, orientated. And the way I would advise you to do that is engage with guidelines. So your own hospital should, for a lot of things, have their own intranet guidelines, things that we don't tend to look at, but they are there. And they'll go through the condition, they'll go through the science, they'll go through what to do, and also go through your internal process, who you should refer to. What. And that's really important, that you understand how your own hospital works. So you start in a new department, even if you know how to manage certain conditions, it's good to run through the internal guidelines to at least know who you refer to, when do you refer. it just comes across a lot slicker, a lot more professional from your part. But I learned a lot, and there's a lot of tertiary and on the guidelines. On the topic of talking about reading guidelines, I would also read sort of the guidelines that are on tertiary centres. A lot of tertiary centres have their guidelines, and they're not meant to be used nationally. They are for their own centre, but they're really good because they give you a good flow diagram about when you sort of escalate to various things, and they are based on national recommendations typically, or if they're not, there is some logic behind it. And then I think you need to sort of just think about how you would apply it to your workplace. It's a good conversation to have with your consultants. It sort of does show that you are a sensible, competent person. It gives off that impression to them. So read guidelines, start thinking practically, what are you going to do with patients? Patients are going to present. You've been in PAU, you've been in neonates, you know what's going to come, what scenarios are all very typical. Common things are common. And so you think about that and say, okay, what would I do? And when do I change tack? And what should I be looking out for? What are the complications that could occur in this patient? And how am I going to manage those things? So reading guidelines, being practically ready is really, though this list is not in no particular order, it is pretty much on the top of my list. The second thing is being proactive. Sort of, you are now the captain of the ship. You are in charge. The consultant's not there. You are managing multiple areas. You need to sort of show that authority without being a bit of a douchebag in the process, but you need to sort of show that you are in control. One of the things is sort of, chasing things up and following through with them. So if you send someone home, make sure that you've chased up their results and you follow through. Maybe that might be, organizing stuff and then communicating it through email, maybe to your consultant that, this patient came in, I've done this, anything different that you would want to do. It does show that you are someone that can be trusted, someone who's very, autonomous, and you're conscientious about your position in the department. So following through with things. And sometimes you might need to keep a little book. I'm really against writing things on sheets of paper. Sheets of paper go missing. They get thrown away and confidential, amongst other things. So a book is very good. And that's something I've developed a habit, especially when you're taking referrals, that you've got this record. So even if someone talks to you a week later, 2 weeks later, did you get this referral, or what advice did you give, or what was the comment? You've got a note of it in a book and it doesn't go away. So I've seen other registrars do that as well, and I think it's a really good habit to have. It's a little, book, can sit in your back pocket. Communicating through email, whilst on top of being proactive, engaging with your consultants. So if you've done something, sorted something out, communicate that through email. Because your consultants change over every week, so you may not see the same consultant again for some time. They may not be on the ward, so stay in touch with them. Let them know that something happened during their week. You've done something, or there's been a problem in the department. You've sorted it out, or there's an issue you would like to make people aware of. Being active on email is really a good way to show sort of, again, your maturity, your authority, just you being a very proactive registrar. One of the things I did was I got into a habit is when I was on night shifts, I would do a little round at 6 o'clock in the morning if I could. And those who I could send home, sort of admissions that you admit because you're not too sure either way. You've had now several hours of observation. You say, actually, you can go home. And you get them ready for home. And then maybe you just could say, look, get the discharge letter done, get the TTOs done, and effectively discharge. They may not leave, but at least when you go to handover, you can say, they're on the list, but I've seen them and I've discharged them, so you don't need to see them. Consultants love that. You've lessened their workload and you've taken initiative, and no one's going to hate you for that. Of course, stay safe, and if you can't do it because of pressures in the department, then don't do it. But it is something to be conscientious about. Don't just leave everything for the day team to do because you couldn't make a decision overnight. Be a bit more proactive, and I think it will go well for you if you sort of adopt that sort of behavior. The second thing, or the third thing actually, I would say is make a plan, make a sensible plan. Don't be scared to make a plan. So with patients, make a plan. It may not be the entirely correct one. There may be things missing within your plan, but that's when you run it by your consultants during huddles, during handovers. At least it shows that you did something along the right lines. They may say, oh no, you know what, do this test as well, add this, or maybe we should get this, but that's fine. Don't take that as a negative. Don't think, oh my god, I failed, I look horrible, why didn't I do this? You did make a plan, they've just added to it. Think about why they want that. Don't be scared to ask that question. Do it in a non-confrontational way, so don't just snap at them, but just say, I just wondered, you wanted this doing, was there a particular reason? Is there something that I should be doing more regularly? And they'll tell you, no, maybe in this case, because of this, I've asked this, or maybe it's just my experience. You've done nothing wrong, but do engage in that conversation, because you learn a lot from that feedback. I think where consultants get really annoyed is when they get called in the middle of the night. So I've got this patient with this problem. They're half asleep, you've woken them up, and they're saying, okay, why are you calling me? So I've told you the history, but there's no question. And with no question, there's no plan. There's no initiation of a plan. It's like, if I were to call my consultant, it would be, I had this patient, I'm calling you because I need advice for this reason. Then go back, tell the story briefly, because they're half asleep, you're not going to remember everything. Just say, I've done X, Y, Z. I'm stuck here, or I don't know what to do next. But at least you've shown you've done something. A lot of conversations I've had throughout my training where consultants have been a bit displeased with behaviors of phone calls is that they've just acted like SHOs. They've given a history with no differential diagnosis, with no plan, and just said, what do I do? Well, you're the registrar. What have you done so far? Why have you got to the point where you're calling me now in the middle of the night? There's nothing wrong with calling consultants. If you need to call your consultant, you should call your consultant. That's absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. But it's also very important to take that initiative. You have been in training for so long now. It's very unlikely you've not seen what's come in front of you. You can at least have half a plan executed. And you should know why you're worried and why you're having a call with them. When you see stuff, go away and read about it. And we say this a lot to medical students. We say this to F1s and every other grade. It becomes ever so more important as a registrar, because you are going to be a consultant soon, right? You know that time is coming. So when you see stuff, it's good to go back and read the guidelines, the national guidelines. There are going to be, papers from the national body of that system, and have a think about, okay, I've seen this, I wasn't really too confident, or I did this, I don't know if I did the right thing. Let me just read a little bit about it. I used to make a list of things and then sort of accumulate them, and then on the weekend I would sit through. And I realized that was a really bad idea for me. It didn't work for me because I had so many things, I didn't fully remember why I was reading this. And then I was just reading it because it was on my list and not making the connection to why it sparked the reason why I should read it. So I think spending 15 minutes, 20 minutes reading it on the same night, it's going to be far more helpful than accumulating it like squirrels and nuts. And then you're going to know what you need to do. So do that. Think about it, because you're, I would say, 100% going to encounter the same situation again. So be prepared second time round. And again, people have allowances when people are registrars, newly appointed registrars. You are going through that transition. Everyone's gone through that transition. You're going through that transition. People after you will go through that transition. It's okay, but you don't want to hit ST7 and then not sure what's what. I think that's a really worrying sign. Support your juniors. You are now near consultant level. You should be looking after your juniors, your SHOs. You should be supporting them. And it's not just with their workload, but giving them mentorship, giving them advice, talking through plans with them. It's a good way for you to learn as well. It's a good way for them to learn. And I used to sit down with my SHO and say, well, let's think practically, what should we do? And I wasn't necessarily teaching them. I was trying to figure out the answer myself, but I was working it out with them. And they could start to see how I thought differently now as a reg than how they were thinking as an SHO. And it helped them to step their game up a little bit as well. Of course, there is some professional boundary you need to create with your SHOs, because you are the reg, you are in charge, but also I wouldn't say you need to be so socially absent. I think you just got to be conscientious about that sort of position, that you hold a responsibility to supporting your juniors. And if you're too chummy with them, sometimes sort of getting them to get tasks done and having them accountable can become also very difficult. So I think it's a balance, but but generally I would say to you, support your juniors, and that's really important. Communicate with your MDT. Make the team aware that you are a registrar, the registrar. Start a ward round, do a board round, communicate with your nurses, come on to shift, you go into CD, catch up with your nurses, halfway through the shift, catch up with your nurses. Even now, when I have to do my ward weeks, I do the board round, I do the ward round, we'll debrief afterwards, double check plans. But it also in the middle of the afternoon, I will go back to my sister and try to say, let's just catch up. And I think that's really important, that you have that, thing where people can understand that you are trying to run the ward and you're doing it as a team, but you are the point of contact in terms of seniority. Of course your consultant is, but they're busy doing other things, so you are sort of that bridge between everyone. And be kind to everyone in your team. Don't walk around like you're sort of untouchable. Communicate, be kind, be supportive to everyone. So I think that's the main things I penciled down in my little list here, my little script. What I thought was very important to sort of point out in that transition into registrarhood. Faced many issues, and I think a lot of what I'm saying to you has come because I've been in those situations. I've learned from my mistakes, which is from my experience, my encounters, and I feel like this is what, if I could go back, probably what I'd tell myself. So I really hope you found that useful. I really hope that it gives you something to think about. It is a scary time becoming a reg, but it's always about engagement. As long as you think about it, and as I always say on TikTok, if you make a plan, you can always move forward. You need a plan. No strategy, then you're just running around in the dark. But I'm sure that the fact that you've engaged and listened to this, so you are conscientious about your next step in your career. And I wish you all the best. Thank you for listening. Subscribe, like, comment. I love to hear from all of you. Take care. Bye-bye.